Hi, I'm Yulia, and this is Burning Questions. The topic that set the internet on fire this week is what's going to happen to Ukraine and the rest of the world with these peace talks now that Trump is showing himself as more allied with Russia.
My name is Michael Mackay. I'm a Canadian, and I've had a lot of experience with Ukraine over the years. I guess I first came to Ukraine soon after the renewal of independence. And at that time, I became a lecturer at the University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy in political science. And that was very exciting. The idea of a university, the languages would be Ukrainian and English. It would be on the North American model of a self-governing university and that kind of thing. Really exciting. And of course, the best part about that was the students there.
That's awesome.
While I was there, I created a program. I became the director of an internet access program, because this is when the internet revolution was sweeping the world, the World Wide Web, and student access program. And I've been back many times, election observer at some of the key events. I first went as for the repeat second round election immediately after the Orange Revolution. That was phenomenal to see the very last days of the Orange Revolution, and then this just amazing election that, of course, Yushchenko won. 2010, when Yanukovych beat Tymoshenko, and then back for the 2014 election, which was the one after the Revolution of Dignity, and of course after the invasion, and that was the one that Poroshenko won. So, and many other visits to Ukraine and time spent there and over the years. So to me, it's been so exciting to see this country emerge from occupation and this Soviet imposition, and which was really an extension of the Russian Empire occupation, and to see what the Ukrainian people still were, despite literally centuries and generations. This fiercely independent people who knew they were a part of Europe, part of the West, and very proud of it, and for good reason.
That's amazing. I also happen to remember the Orange Revolution. I was in, I believe, 5th grade, so a bit less of a memory than you have. But I used to paint posters for Yushchenko and put them around my school, and I would make my parents take me to protests. And my grandmother's friend, I remember vividly, he was Russian speaking. Well, he still is Russian speaking, and he voted for Yanukovych. And I had such inflamed arguments with him as a 5th grader. I was telling him that if he doesn't understand how he's destroying this country, I can't explain it to him. But, I guess that was the beginning of my vast interest in politics. Well, Orange Revolution was so long ago, and it seems like, it was such a pivotal and such a turning point for Ukraine. But then there was another turning point in 2014 and another turning point in 2022. And now I think we're approaching another turning point. And it's upsetting because I don't know if we can trust the US in what they're doing with this very important moment for, I think, everybody in the world. Based on the peace talks and everything that's been happening, how do you sort of evaluate the trust of Europe and Canada and allies in the United States and their ability to negotiate this peace on best terms for Ukraine? Because it does seem like they're quite favorable to Russia.
Yes. I think that trust has collapsed in Ukraine, the rest of Europe, and in Canada very rapidly. I think we would not have guessed this. I mean, this is only the middle of March, and uh, Trump only took office in the middle of January. So in 2 short months, it has collapsed. Uh, and I think more people see that these negotiations are not about a ceasefire that will lead to peace, and more people see that it is Russia imposing its will through the United States and try to do that on Ukraine, frankly, because they can't win on the battlefield. And this is the only way. They gambled everything on getting Trump back into the White House, and now they're gambling everything on this payoff because they can't win otherwise. But the good thing I see is, well, Ukraine is in a very difficult spot because they can't say what's really true about all of this. They have to navigate things diplomatically. But there's other countries that are freer because of not the immediate danger. So, for example, Germany, to be able to do what's really rearmament, which is essential. And personally, I can tell you that the change in mood in Canada, I think you would be astonished at how quick it is. I do a comparison to the shift in Ukraine from the substantial feeling, oh, we're brother Slavs, because that was propaganda for so many years, right? And and a lot of people felt that, especially older Ukrainians, right, who have never known anything like that. But then the invasion of 2014, and then that starts to change. And you're talking about your Russian-speaking friend, and I started to pick up at that time this idea of Russian-speaking Ukrainian nationalists, and I thought that was so fascinating. And of course, since then, they've said, all these people, no, my Ukrainian has to get better. People would say things like that, and so the public realm has changed, certainly from when I first came to Kiev, and apart from the Western Ukraine, people were speaking Russian everywhere. But the mood in Canada has just, we're boycotting U.S. goods. There's those little Canadian flags on the Canadian produced goods. And instead of putting how in, for example, Ukrainian supermarkets, there'd be little Russian flags on the imported goods before it stopped completely.
Yeah.
We don't do that here. We don't put little American flags. We've now got, this is just in the last couple of weeks, the letter T to say that tariffs have been applied on it. So for people know, first of all, it's going to be more expensive. And then the other that comes from the US. And it is just collapsed. The feeling is just astonishing. And I grew up where people go back and forth to the US and, they're almost like us, and you can barely tell the difference in the accent and all of this kind of thing. And it has just changed so rapidly. So you were talking about trust, and I'm saying this collapse of trust in Ukraine, where they have to be cautious about expressing that. The rest of Europe, where they hopefully there's this mood, look, we can't just talk anymore. We have to really make good on European security. And in Canada, again, the government does have to be cautious because of the close cut ties in trade and our complete defense dependency on the US. But it is changing rapidly.
No, I've definitely noticed a very rapid shift in Canadian attitude towards America. I mean, why wouldn't it change, right? Someone actually said a very interesting thing. We were talking about Russia's treatment of Ukraine and obviously the war, and they said, I actually understand this now better than ever because it feels like Trump and the US want to turn Canada into America's Ukraine, like the same way as Russia did that, because obviously Trump is over there threatening to invade Canada and a series of other nations. And then his press secretary jokes about the 51st state, which is just absolutely insane that this is, generally accepted as a joke and allowed to be said out loud. But what do Canadians think about about what Trump has been saying about invading Canada and about the 51st state situation?
Well, I think most Canadians are bewildered because this is so unusual, angry, and that kind of thing. But what I see looking at it is, and I observed this from the first time I started to pay attention to Trump, which was around 2015 when the what I now recognize was Russia's Trump for President active measure really got started. And that was, he was saying things that Americans just don't say. But then I realized in his clumsy way, it's exactly the thing that Russians would say. And I started to see this pattern of repeating Russian propaganda. So you talk about 51st state. Now, people want to always try to make it sound sane, right? Because it is so insane. And they say he's joking. But I have been writing and saying that it's not a joke to him. And I was saying to say Canada should be the 51st state is not a joke. It's propaganda. It's an active measure. It's even more than that, that leads to invasion. And it's similar to Putin and the other Russian propagandists talking about Novorossiya in 2014. And then people who know better say, Novorossiya, there's no such thing, right? You just made it up. And you made up a flag, and there's nothing to this. And I remember talking to people in Luhansk at the time, and they were saying, when the Luhansk People's Republic came around, and they said, who are these people? We don't know them. They're nobodies, or they're criminals. And that was true. And you look at we have something similar. We call it either Maple MAGA or MAGA North. And they'll be anonymous, and they'll put like flags of Alberta or the Canadian flag from before the maple leaf, and they'll talk about how this is a great idea. And I'd say to people, no, it's all fake. Try to find the real people, and you'll find a tiny, tiny number that is the joke, but it amplified here. Just like the LPR, the DNR, the people in favor of Crimea annexation, it was mostly made up, right? Even though, what was the vote for Crimea independence that was legitimate? It was like 4% support for Aksionov, right? In the last proper, and you say 4%. Yeah, that's kind of like the 2% that voted for the extreme right parties in Ukraine in the presidential elections. You're always going to have those kinds of numbers of people in any democracy.
Exactly.
So I think I'm trying to get people to realize that it's not a joke in any way. And it is incredibly dangerous rhetoric that leads to invasion, or more likely hybrid warfare measures of various kinds.
I mean, and it does catch on. I've seen quite a few MAGA flags, or Make America Great Again, or Trump 2024 flags on people's houses in farm country in Ontario. And I thought it was so weird because Trump is not running for president of Canada. Why do you have Trump 2024 flags on your homes? Like that just makes no sense. It's kind of like, it's the same as if someone in Russia in any given election before 2014 had, flags up for a Ukrainian president, or vice versa, or like in Ukraine for a Polish president. It makes no sense. What are you talking about? This kind of doesn't compute.
And those flags were not clumsy hand-drawn flags or anything. They were manufactured, weren't they? Yeah,
those that you buy on Amazon. Yeah.
You see, I live in Ottawa, and we had something that we're now calling the Siege of Ottawa, where these people came. They called it a trucker convoy, but in fact, I was writing at the time that this is a Titushky rent-a-mob. And
Mm,
we're seeing it in Ottawa. And it was orchestrated violence. And they came and they blocked the streets and they honked the horns. And the area where I live right downtown, was kind of a no-go zone. Um,
interesting.
and this was, and we're calling it the Siege of Ottawa, and they call it, oh, it's protest, and but it was so confused. You had to realize that what they were saying had no connection to what they were doing, and of course we know that's true about so many of these orchestrated so-called protests that Ukraine has seen in so many years, and again, I hearken back to I was writing at the time about the comparison. There were events, these orchestrated so-called protests, and now some of them were successful. For example, in Luhansk in 2014, there was the siege of the SBU building, and
Mm,
oh, it's against the Maidan coup leaders and kind of stuff. And of course, that was nonsense. And on the other hand, in a place like I remember Zaporizhia, the people surrounded the Titushky,
mm-hmm.
and the police, which at the time had many collaborators with them, basically had to protect them and get them out. And so this orchestrated beginning of what was the invasion succeeded in Luhansk and didn't succeed in Zaporizhia.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, it was a very confused time overall. And so I was writing at the time that in Ottawa, so many of these tactics, because you look at, again, ignore what these people are saying and look at what they're doing, and the effect that it has. Also, trying to get people to say that when they were saying things, like they were using an obscenity, they were saying "F Trudeau," and
Mm-hmm.
um, and they're saying, okay, that's not the Canadian democratic tradition. That's not saying, oh, I oppose Trudeau's policy and I will vote against him at the next election. Right?
Yeah.
That's what a peaceful democratic people will say, because there
Yeah.
always will be the next election here. No, they were saying that he has to go out now, and that, well, what? How are you going to do that? Like, and so the fact that they wouldn't even adopt the the practice of peaceful protest and the
Mm-hmm.
language of democracy told me, no, there's something else going on here.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it was called Freedom Convoy, right? And it's actually very interesting because when it was happening in Canada, so many people in the US were kind of like, oh my gosh, these crazy freedom convoyers, right? Like, how does that even happen? And it's kind of like, well, I mean, looking from the US now, I think you fully understand how that happens because Freedom Convoy was like one small-ish part of the Canadian, of the Canadian sort of political situation. And we have full-on MAGA in the office and people that draw crosses on their foreheads for Ash Wednesday and appear like that on TV, like it's a Black Mirror episode. There is just, I think Freedom Convoy in Canada is nothing compared to what MAGA does in the legitimate government of the United States and how they disregard the law and legal process. And it does, I keep saying this, but it does remind me of what Trump is doing today is very close to Russia in the early 2000s when Putin was reforming the entire system. And it's quite scary. But speaking of that, and speaking of the close relationship between Trump and Putin, it seems like there have been a couple of reports that he admitted to in an interview to a publication, I believe it was the New York Times or maybe the Washington Post, that he does have unregulated phone calls with Putin, not just those that he was having that were on record and notes were taken on those. So he's mentioned a couple of times that he would like Russia to return to the G7, which is insane. He also talks constantly about regulating the normal relationship between Russia and the United States and the possibility of massive future economic partnerships. So my question is, how would that influence Russia's ability to wage a war? And what is Russia's ability to wage the war in its current economic condition?
Well, if any of that happened, it would dramatically improve Russia's ability to wage the war. In fact, that's the only purpose of it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you see, again, the language is, oh, massive US investment in Russia. What's really going on? Well, Trump is a grifter and he wants a piece of this. And of course, Putin is the head of a transnational crime syndicate. So it's not investment in Russia. It never would be. So it would be that Trump would and his crime family would get a slice of the pie, and Putin would get financing for the war to continue it indefinitely, which he absolutely has to do to stay in power and stay alive. So that, again, we can't go with that kind of language. Of course, back into the G7, which is, of course, insane. This is about legitimizing Russia. Yes, and what does that go against? It goes against the reality that Russia is a terrorist state, and terrorist states don't belong in these civil international non-governmental organizations and that kind of thing. So a good example that I always draw upon, look what the Council of Europe did, and its democratic, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. They expelled Russia. And what happened? They immediately went from this useless talk shop to actually what they were supposed to be. The Council of Europe is all about human rights in Europe. And it became that. And look about organizations that didn't do that. The OECD, for example. Russia has broken the Helsinki Final Act. So as long as it's a member of the OECD, the OECD is meaningless. Now, one good thing about the G7, and this is just good luck, the G7 meeting is going to be held in Canada this year. And Mark Carney, who became prime minister like last week, he just made an announcement. First of all, he invited President Zelensky to come. So he has a formal invitation from Canada, and he absolutely refused the idea that Russia would be invited back to the G7. Right now, whoever hosts it next year could make up their own mind about that. But we're good for this year. Is what's interesting is, will Trump even come to Canada? That's what's interesting. Zelensky will be there, and Canada. What did Trump call it? That we're very nasty people. Oh, that's what Trump said. Yeah, we're nasty people. Yeah, it's just terrible.
Right, because
we're impossible to deal with. He said that about Zelensky and Ukrainians, that they're very difficult to deal with, and then he contrasted with how wonderful Putin is to deal with. You were talking about all these conversations, and I think what I've appreciated hearing from Ukrainians and experts in Russian hybrid warfare is people saying, well, of course there have been all these unregulated conversations because Putin needs to exercise reflexive control over Trump, and he's a master at it. He can do it. If doing it directly is the best way to do it, because he's convinced Trump that he's his friend, and Trump is a very weak man, and that succeeds. When he can't do that, he of course uses go-betweens, and this is something Ukrainians know very well. And I learned a word that Ukrainians use. They call these people sometimes gray cardinals. Gray cardinals are sometimes curators. And so, for example, Paul Manafort was one. And he was the one for Yanukovych. And then Putin reassigned him to say, oh, you're going to manage Trump because, Yanukovych has fled Ukraine and he's not as valuable an asset anymore. But it looks like Trump has more value.
Yeah.
So I keep saying, people, why don't you listen to Ukrainians? Because it's happened there already, and you have no reason to be surprised that it's happening here.
Well, with Americans, as to why they don't listen to Ukrainians, and I say this from personal experience of living there for a long time, right? America does have a God complex, where Americans do think they're much more developed than other countries. They have better intelligence than other countries, and that if something like that were happening, they would know. So listening to a nation smaller and less important geopolitically would kind of be, a little a little below America's level. Because again, if there were Russian active measures happening in America on such a large scale as, the higher government, they would know. But they don't know. And that's the thing. We've already dealt with it, and we know exactly how it happens and what happens. And I remember sounding the alarm bells when Trump was first running, right? I was like, you guys, this is not okay. Like, something's wrong here. This guy, first of all, I couldn't remember why he gave me such a visceral reaction. And then I realized that he sounds exactly like Yanukovych, just American, and they're like the same phenotype of a person. And I was like, wow, okay, well, that makes a lot of sense. Because by the time that Trump was running, I already haven't heard Yanukovych in like 4 years or something like that. So I could, I repressed those memories in my mind. And then I was watching some Russian propaganda documentary, actually, because I was studying it. And Yanukovych came on, and it was an interview with him. And I was like, oh my God, okay, well, that just clicked. I understand why I have such a visceral reaction to him, because that's what Russia does. Russia finds the same type of person, and it's usually a very egotistical, egomaniacal person that's easy to manipulate because they want power. And I think that the relationship between Trump and Putin, and Putin and Orban, and Putin and Yanukovych, was that, they admire Putin for this big dictator, a rich guy who's like gotten all of this power, right? And he makes it seem like he treats them as an equal, as in like they're friends, right? But in reality, they're useful idiots that he uses. He doesn't see them as friends. He doesn't respect them, and they think he does. And that's why they dance to his music, because they think it's an equal partnership here. While really what they're doing is they're serving his agenda, and he's going to discard of them the second he doesn't need them anymore. And that's a sad reality for them. But I mean, with what they have done to the world, I don't think I feel that sad for them. Well, what do you see as the prospect of these peace talks? How do you see Europe's involvement and Canada's involvement, and what's going to happen if Trump attempts to force Ukraine into capitulation?
Well, first of all, I think everyone understands that they're not peace talks, even though they might be called that, because, again, there's this insanity. If they were peace talks, they would be talks between the countries that are at war, and they're not. So there's something else going on. So again, there's a difficulty of language, and if they're not peace talks, what are they? Well, we know it's imposition of Russian demands through a third party is what it is. So again, we have difficulty just describing what's going on because it's unfamiliar to so many people. And the press is no help at all, because what happens if Trump makes a demand, recognize Crimea as part of the Russian Federation? I don't think it would be as disastrous as you make, because first of all, every other country would say no, and of course Ukraine would say no. And then what's the effect? What's Trump going to do about it? Lash out at every other country, every other democracy in the world, including Ukraine? And he can't do anything about it. And it would actually expose how weak his position is. It actually would not strengthen Russia's position. I mean, take, for example, President Erdogan in Turkey. He said just a few days ago that Turkey will never recognize that Crimea is Russia, and he said Crimea is Ukraine. Now, of course, he has his own reasons for that. The bond that he wants to strengthen with the Crimean Tatar people. Just a sidelight, I was visiting Crimea a couple of years before the invasion, and just wonderful place. And I was so impressed with all this construction going on in these Crimean villages. And then my driver just told me, "Oh yeah, it's all paid for by Turkey." I said, "Well, good, because the Ukrainian government isn't doing it. Yeah. That these places need development and so on." Anyway, so I don't think it would be the disaster it would say. It would expose Trump's weak position there, and it would also show that the sort of both sidism that they're trying to get across would collapse and said, no, you're on Russia's side. So how can you be part of anything that actually is a peace process? And so I think it would, of course, be discouraging. We would want it would also weaken the U.S. because people would see it as even more an unreliable partner. How can the United States go from saying Crimea is Ukraine and Ukraine's territorial integrity must be upheld to saying the opposite
Yeah.
and rewarding Russia? So I would say you realize you're destroying everything the U.S. has stood for and built since President Wilson went to Versailles and was a big part of the treaty that ended the First World War. So about a century, and you're saying, no, that's all garbage. You know, that's it would just be devastating to the U.S., but not necessarily to Ukraine. It would, of course, make defending Ukraine more difficult, more lengthy, more painful, more people would suffer, and that's completely unacceptable. It would leave people under occupation longer. That is completely unacceptable. So it would be outrageous. But I hope people would do something with this anger. I mean, people other than Ukrainians. Ukrainians are going to defend themselves no matter what. I mean, people outside Ukraine to say, no, we've got to act instead of just making statements all the time.
Yeah. Well, I sure hope that, the rest of Europe and the rest of the what we like to call the free world or Western democracies, including Canada and Australia, really do take the matters in their own hands because, it is definitely it's a big thing. I was actually speaking to someone from the UK the other day, right, about this situation between the US and Canada and everything that Trump says, and how Keir Starmer is trying to play this role of Trump's friend, basically kind of similarly to what Trump does to Putin, right? Because Keir Starmer is trying to use this position of him of the UK not being in the EU that Trump hates so much to sort of like reason with him and be friends. But obviously you can't reason with someone like Trump. And, a lot of people in the UK like Keir Starmer. I do too. I like a lot of his Ukraine policies. I like a lot of his foreign policies. I don't like what he's doing with Trump. But a friend of mine who's English was like, the problem with his approach to Trump is that if Trump were to invade Canada tomorrow, the EU would react faster than we would, and Canada is under the crown. That really does put into perspective how much the world order is shifting and how much we're seeing a shift in, like people say this big phrase, the world order, but what really is the world order? It's the agreements between democracies and between countries that are not ruled by dictators to behave. It's kind of like, it's just rules and regulations, the same way as those same religious people that are against them and that justify breaking these rules and regulations think that the Bible is a rule and regulation that should be abided by everyone, right? Because it's the beacon of the moral character. So the world order is basically the beacon of the moral character of countries and how they should behave in an ecosystem with each other. And we are seeing how that's shifting and how no one cares about this ecosystem anymore and about respecting each other's boundaries and each other's borders and really geopolitics. And I do really hope that, this kind of the US shifting its stance on protecting democracies will really awaken the rest of the world to act faster, because we have been dragging our feet quite profoundly.
Yeah. You talked about the U.S. and its God complex, which makes it difficult for it to accept what is good in other countries as their own or accept criticism or so on. I think there's a real advantage of being in a country like Canada or Ukraine, where people grow up knowing you're actually not the center of the universe. So how do you get along where the world is not entirely like you? And the answer, well, in Canada is, well, you maintain peaceful relations with countries, and you trade, and you learn about as much as you can about other places and other people on their own terms. And that's not the approach Americans have taken. There's a substantial number of Americans who support Trump are proud that they don't have a passport. And now, for someone like in Canada or Ukraine to say, you know, a passport is something you just have to have. You mean you can't leave your country? Oh yeah, everything I need is here, kind of thing. Like, who thinks that? And an advantage of smaller countries is having this. Now, what's difficult now is how countries have to quickly remap. And I really admire countries that have shifted, again, knowing that, of course, you're proud of your country, but you're not the whole universe. Take Poland, for example, to realize that, oh, we're proud that we're part of NATO, but the US might not come to our aid.
Yeah.
Despite, and let's arm ourselves. The Baltic countries are in a similar kind of position. Canada, very shift now. Okay, with a free trading nation. We wouldn't be a prosperous nation if we weren't. And that means keeping promises and deals and then so on. Oh, wait a minute. It turns out when we're like that, if we have too much trade dependency on the US, we're actually weak and vulnerable if they do what they're doing now. Answer, we'd better diversify our trade. And again, start to rethink our defense arrangements of relying entirely on the US when in fact they could be an enemy and not a supporter. So I think Canada is a little bit later than, say, Poland and the Baltic countries. But of course, everybody's later than Ukraine. I mean, look at what was the in 2014? People say there were maybe 6,000 combat effective soldiers in the Ukrainian army. And we all know about the corruption that was a legacy of the Yanukovych years. But then look what happened: the volunteer battalions and things like that, and then building a professional army that's one of the most powerful in Europe. Is just still not as powerful as it needs to be to liberate Ukraine at this moment, but that is phenomenal. And then I look at Canada and I said, well, we don't have the pressure of the immediate invasion, but we need to start thinking in those terms. And people are just not used to it, but that doesn't matter. We have to adjust.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's kind of, I like to say this, everyone is a pacifist until war comes to your doorstep. And no one really arms until you have to defend your cities, which is how these volunteer battalions started to begin with. So I really do hope that with everything that's happening and with the US being one of the largest world superpowers that used to protect democracies and now could be an enemy, with all of this transpiring, I really do hope that most of the Western world is going to take this seriously, and most of the Western world is going to start fending for themselves and being prepared, because it's always, it's always when it's already too late that we start actually doing something.
I'm just going to, quickly say that the pressure of reality forces people to change, and it's a matter of survival.
Yeah, it is. I really do agree with it. And I mean, I was a pacifist. I used to not, I hated guns and I hated weapons. And I mean, I still do to an extent, but it's, at this point, it's not, I can't hate them, because that's something that keeps, a roof over my head and my family alive. But thank you so much for having this conversation. I really enjoyed it, and I really hope to see you here again sometime.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure.
Thank you so much, Michael. Well, I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did, and if you would like to hear more like it, please don't forget to subscribe to this channel and also turn on all of your notifications so you don't miss when the next episode comes out. And of course, do share it with a friend or a family member or someone you feel like might want to listen to it. Give this video a like and leave a comment. Don't forget to give me your thoughts, questions, suggestions, or anything on your mind. I really do appreciate this communication, and I will see you next time.